Story 1. It all began when my family and I moved to a quiet suburban neighborhood, hoping to find peace and tranquility away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Our new house was nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by tall, ancient trees that cast eerie shadows in the moonlight. Little did we know that our neighbor, Mr. Haroldson, would soon become the source of our worst nightmares. Mr. Haroldson lived in the house next door, a dilapidated Victorian mansion that looked like it had been plucked from the pages of a horror novel. His presence was as unsettling as his house, and he rarely ventured out during the day. He had an unnerving habit of staring at us from behind his curtains whenever we stepped outside. His eyes, sunken and malevolent, seemed to follow our every move. It didn't take long for rumors to circulate in the neighborhood about Mr. Haroldson. Some said he was a recluse, while others whispered that he had a dark past. But the most disturbing rumor of all was that he had a collection of dolls, lifelike, porcelain dolls that he treated as if they were real children. I dismissed these tales as mere gossip, but as the days turned into weeks, strange occurrences began to unfold. One chilly autumn evening, I was in our backyard, raking leaves when I heard a faint, eerie melody. It sounded like a lullaby, soft and haunting. I followed the sound, and to my shock, it led me to Mr. Haroldsson's house. I stood there, hidden behind the trees, watching in horror as he cradled one of his porcelain dolls, singing to it in a voice that sent chills down my spine. It was as if he believed the doll was his own flesh and blood. I rushed back to my house, unable to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the lullaby in my mind, haunting me like a sinister lullaby from a nightmare. As weeks turned into months, the situation escalated. Our pets started disappearing mysteriously, and I couldn't help but suspect Mr. Haroldsson's involvement. When I questioned him about it, he merely smiled, his lips curling into a grotesque grin that sent shivers down my spine. He claimed to have seen nothing unusual. One evening, as I was browsing the local news, I came across a shocking headline. It turned out that several children had gone missing in our town over the years, and the police were baffled by the lack of evidence. My heart sank as I began to connect the dots. Mr. Haroldsson's obsession with dolls, his eerie lullabies, and the missing pets all seemed to point in a disturbing direction. Determined to uncover the truth, I started researching Mr. Haroldsson's past. What I discovered sent a chill down my spine. It turned out that he had been a school teacher in another town, and several of his former students had mysteriously disappeared, never to be found again. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and it seemed that Mr. Haroldson was far more sinister than anyone had ever imagined. As I delved deeper into my investigation, I stumbled upon a horrifying revelation. Mr. Haroldsson's collection of porcelain dolls was not limited to inanimate objects. Hidden in the depths of his decaying mansion, I found a room filled with life-size dolls, eerily lifelike replicas of the missing children. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I entered the room, and I could almost hear their silent cries for help. Terrified and determined to put an end to Mr. Haroldsson's reign of terror, I contacted the police. When they arrived at his house, they discovered a nightmarish scene. Mr. Haroldson, driven by his obsession with the missing children, had been kidnapping and imprisoning them in his macabre collection of life-size dolls. The children were found in various states of decay, their faces contorted in eternal agony. Mr. Haroldson was arrested, and his mansion was sealed off as a crime scene. The entire neighborhood was in shock, and we all struggled to come to terms with the horror that had been lurking next door for so long. The memory of those life-size dolls and the children they once were still haunts my nightmares. In the end, justice was served, but the scars of that terrifying ordeal will never fully heal. I often find myself staring at Mr. Haroldsson's abandoned mansion, wondering what other horrors might be hidden within its dark and twisted corridors. The true neighbor horror story I've shared with you is a chilling reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, and that the line between reality and nightmare can blur in the most terrifying ways imaginable. Story 2. I never believed in the supernatural until I moved into my new apartment. It was a quaint, old building with creaky floors and an eerie charm that attracted me at first. Little did I know that my neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, would introduce me to a world of terror beyond my wildest nightmares. Mrs. Carmichael was an elderly woman who lived next door, and from the moment I moved in, she gave me an unsettling feeling. Her eyes, a pale shade of gray, seemed to pierce right through me whenever we crossed paths in the dimly lit hallway. She was always impeccably dressed, wearing old-fashioned, black mourning attire that made her look like she had stepped out of a bygone era. The strange occurrences began shortly after I settled into my new apartment. It started with faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls at night. At first, I dismissed them as my imagination playing tricks on me, but they grew louder and more distinct with each passing night. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with me from beyond the walls. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a distinct voice among the whispers. It was Mrs. Carmichael's voice, and she was repeating a haunting phrase, "Join us, dear, join us." My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my brow. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The next day, I decided to confront Mrs. Carmichael about the eerie whispers. I knocked on her door, and she greeted me with that same unnerving gaze. When I asked her if she had heard anything strange, she simply smiled and said, "Oh, my dear, it's just the voices of those who once lived here. They want company." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Determined to uncover the truth, I began researching the history of the building. It didn't take long to discover a dark and unsettling past. The apartment complex had once been a sanatorium for the mentally ill, and many patients had died within its walls under mysterious circumstances. Mrs. Carmichael had lived there for decades, and it seemed she had become obsessed with the spirits of the deceased. As the weeks passed, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. I could hear the voices of the long-dead patients, pleading with me to join them in their torment. Sleep became a distant memory, and I was consumed by fear and paranoia. One evening, as I was on the brink of madness, I decided to confront Mrs. Carmichael once more. This time, I found her sitting in a dimly lit room, surrounded by old photographs and candles. She was speaking to the spirits, her eyes glazed over with an unnatural intensity. Desperate to escape the nightmare, I packed my belongings and prepared to leave the apartment. But as I made my way to the front door, I felt a cold hand grab my wrist. I turned to see Mrs. Carmichael, her eyes now filled with a malevolent energy I couldn't comprehend. She whispered, "You can't leave, dear. You belong here now." In a panic, I wrenched myself free from her grip and fled the building, leaving behind all of my possessions. I never returned to that apartment, and I can still hear the whispers of the tormented souls whenever I close my eyes. Mrs. Carmichael's sinister invitation to join them continues to haunt me, a constant reminder that there are forces beyond our understanding, lurking in the most unexpected places. Story 3. It was a seemingly ordinary suburban neighborhood, where the houses all had picket fences and well-manicured lawns. I had just moved into the small blue house at the end of the street, hoping to find peace and solitude in this picturesque setting. However, the tranquility I sought would soon be shattered by my neighbor, Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins lived in the house next door, a nondescript beige structure that blended in with the rest of the neighborhood. At first glance, he appeared to be an ordinary, middle-aged man. He had a neatly trimmed beard and always wore a suit, even on the hottest of summer days. But beneath that veneer of normalcy lurked something sinister. It didn't take long for me to notice that Mr. Jenkins was different from the other neighbors. He rarely left his house during the day, and when he did, he would dart to his car as if afraid of being seen. but it was his nighttime activities that truly set him apart. Late at night, I would often hear strange, otherworldly sounds emanating from Mr. Jenkins' house. Unearthly whispers and eerie chants would drift through the walls, making it impossible for me to sleep. At first, I thought it might be a bizarre hobby or an unusual interest in the occult, but the sounds grew more disturbing with each passing night. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate. I peered through my bedroom window, which had a clear view of Mr. Jenkins' backyard. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. Mr. Jenkins was standing in his backyard, surrounded by an eerie glow. He was dressed in a dark robe, and his hands moved in strange, arcane patterns as he chanted in a language I couldn't understand. As I watched in horror, a shadowy figure emerged from the ground beneath him. It was a creature, twisted and grotesque, with elongated limbs and piercing red eyes. It seemed to obey Mr. Jenkins' every command, moving with a malevolent grace. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was witnessing something beyond my comprehension, something truly unnatural. Terrified and unable to sleep, I began to research Mr. Jenkins. My inquiries led me to a dark corner of the internet where I discovered stories of his past. It was said that he had once been involved in a secretive cult that practiced dark rituals and worshipped ancient, malevolent entities. The cult had disappeared many years ago, but Mr. Jenkins had apparently continued its sinister traditions in the privacy of his home. Determined to uncover the truth, I reached out to the local authorities. When they arrived to investigate, they found evidence of Mr. Jenkins' disturbing rituals, including occult symbols and books filled with incantations. They arrested him, and the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the nightmare was far from over. In the days that followed, I began to experience inexplicable phenomena in my own home. Objects moved on their own, and strange symbols appeared on my walls. I couldn't escape the feeling that the malevolent entities summoned by Mr. Jenkins had not left our neighborhood. Desperate to protect myself, I sought the help of a local paranormal expert. Together, we performed a cleansing ritual in my house to banish the lingering presence. As we chanted incantations and sprinkled salt, I felt a sense of dread lift, and the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued me began to dissipate. Mr. Jenkins was ultimately found guilty of practicing dark magic and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The neighborhood slowly returned to its peaceful state, and I was able to put the horrors of those months behind me. But the experience left me forever changed, a firm believer in the existence of malevolent forces lurking in the most unexpected places. To this day, I can't help but glance nervously at Mr. Jenkins' empty house next door, wondering if the darkness that once consumed it might one day return. The true neighbor horror story I've shared with you is a chilling reminder that evil can reside in even the most idyllic settings, waiting to reveal itself when you least expect it.